This is episode 398 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation of Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined this week by my old friend, Brian Riedl. He is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He works on budget, tax, and economic policy. But Brian and I, we go back to, oh gosh, I guess you could say the last century there, Brian. And I mean that by the 90s and Washington, D.C., and your time at the Heritage Foundation. But thanks for coming back on Tipping Point, New Mexico.
Glad to be here, Paul. It's been a long time we've known each other.
Yeah, well, you have been working on restraining federal spending since then, and even before I
Pretty
met
bad
you.
results if you look at the budget today.
Yeah, I don't want to say you pass judgment on your career, but yeah, it hasn't gone very well restraining federal spending. But you are practically trying to do the impossible there, so I won't hold it against you. But we're going to talk both about the Biden administration's budget as well as kind of the issues going on right now in our economy relating to inflation. And since inflation is the one that really is affecting people on a day-to-day basis, and you just told me that you're going to be testifying before Congress on inflation. You are against inflation, as you said off the air, but tell us about kind of the what is inflation, generally speaking. Let's walk through what it is before we get started and what's causing it and some of the factors that could be addressed with regard to inflation.
Thanks, Paul. Well, I think as we're all experiencing right now, inflation is a general rise in prices across the economy. If some prices are rising and some prices are falling, that's not inflation. That's just a shift. But if prices are generally rising on average across the entire economy, that's inflation. For the last 30 years, we've typically had prices rise by about 1.5% to 2% per year, which is manageable and predictable. And we've made sure that our wages have risen in tandem and so that people haven't fallen behind. But what's happened in the past 2 years, as again, we've all experienced, is a surge in inflation. In fact, over the last 12 months, prices have rose 8.5% across the economy, even more in certain areas, a little less in other areas. And the danger for a lot of families is your wages, for the most part, have not risen 8.5%. So your purchasing power of your income is falling, and that's obviously causing a lot of stress, as it should.
Now, I mean, inflation is not a new problem. It's new to a lot of people who haven't been around very long, but we're not exactly graybeards or anything. So we can remember the late '70s and early '80s when inflation had to be slain previously. Uh, and Milton Friedman said inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, meaning that it comes from government printing money. Based on your understanding of the inflationary forces, what is fundamentally causing the situation? Is it the spending and money printing, which I know that is your bailiwick, but what other areas of the economy are kind of creating the situation?
Well, I mean, I think starting out with some of the secondary factors, there is supply chain issues right now, which essentially means that we want to buy things from, say, Asia, and it's getting harder to get the things from Asia. It's getting harder to sail them across the Pacific, in part because we're demanding a lot more things from over there, and in part because of just general backlogs. And so we can't get the items as fast enough to sail across the Pacific Ocean, and so demand rises and prices rise. You also have general demand patterns that can cause inflation, which is to say, we're demanding more goods and fewer services, and it's been hard to keep up with the demand for the goods, and so that's putting pressure on prices. But I would say those are kind of secondary factors. What you need to look at is, you quoted Freeman that inflation is generally caused by too much money chasing too few goods. During the pandemic, the Federal Reserve printed essentially $3 trillion and set that out into the economy to help finance all the expensive bills. When you add $3 trillion to the economy, you're going to have more money chasing the same number of goods. Of course, that's going to be inflationary. Relatedly, you had a lot of this money that the Federal Reserve printed come out during the American Rescue Plan, which was the big $1.9 trillion spending bill that was passed about a year ago by President Biden and the new Democratic Congress. This was particularly inflationary because at that point, the economy was actually recovering pretty well. The output gap was $420 billion, meaning the economy was producing $420 billion less than its optimal level, which in a $20 trillion economy means we were getting pretty close. Well, they shot a $1.9 trillion bazooka into a $420 billion output gap. Now, you can't actually increase GDP by 1.9 trillion at that point. You can only increase GDP by 420 billion. So ultimately, the rest just put upward pressure on prices. And at the time, I mean, Larry Summers, Jason Furman, other Democratic economists warned the Biden administration. The American Rescue Plan is too big and too inflationary. And the White House did it anyway, and now we have inflation.
Now, we've spent and printed a lot of money as a country in the last couple of years during the COVID pandemic. Some of that happened under President Trump. Some of that happened under President Biden. Uh, can you walk us through those various stimulus plans? Because it's not always easy to remember what happened and who was in control, and assess, were these kind of more on the necessary side or maybe a little bit over the top? And you already mentioned the Biden initial one. That this was what, in January, right after he took office, right? That was that.
Yeah, yeah. He unveiled it in January. It was signed in March of 2021. I mean, we've had huge government spending hikes. We had the CARES Act, which was the biggest one under President Trump. This was shortly after the pandemic began. It was a $3 trillion bill. This is what created the business subsidies, the individual subsidies, the tax rebates, the unemployment, the unemployment provisions. It started the health research. That was $3 trillion. We then had a couple $100 billion in small bills that kept passing. And then in December of 2020, right before he left office, President Trump signed a $900 billion essentially stimulus bill. This was the one that had the smaller $600 rebates that the Democrats said should be $2,000 and led to the Republicans losing the 2 Senate seats. The Trump had threatened to veto the bill, but ultimately he signed it. And then it was after that, just 2 months later, President Biden came in and did the American Rescue Plan of 1.9 trillion. So we've had about $5 or $6 trillion in new federal spending and tax changes just responding to the pandemic. And a lot of this was funded not by borrowing just existing money, but ultimately it was funded by the Federal Reserve printing about $3 trillion during that period. Federal spending is not going to be as inflationary if you're borrowing it out of the economy, because if that's the case, you're just taking money from one group and giving it to another group. But if it's coming with the Federal Reserve printing money, then really, literally, the new money that government is spending is coming off the printing press, essentially, and that's how you get the inflation.
Okay, and I definitely want to talk about that in a second, but in that phenomenon, because it is a critical part of this. But just to kind of clarify, I remember obviously the Trump the big one, the initial one with the PPP payments and all that. That was in the pretty early days of the pandemic, and I had my criticisms of that particular plan, but unfortunately, it was kind of taken as a fact that shutting down our economy and kind of telling people just stay home was the way to address the pandemic. I think there might be a lot more debate and discussion about that at this point, but it was the early days and people, kind of thought that this was going to kill millions and millions of people, not just what it did, which it had its negative impacts, but certainly there was a lot more concern and questioning about that. And so that was a overwhelmingly bipartisan bill in Congress, right?
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, virtually all of this up until the American Rescue Plan was bipartisan. Both parties owned this. And that's why I get a little frustrated when people talk about how Trump ran up the deficit in 2020. Well, actually, both parties ran up the deficit in 2020. Much of what the CARES Act did was bipartisan because the viewpoint was, look, if the government is going to shut down the economy, if it's going to shut down your business, if it's going to tell individuals you cannot go to work, that is essentially a government takings, and they have an obligation to compensate you for that. That's not welfare. That's not a handout. That's the government actively shutting down your job or your business. You need to be compensated. There was also the basic economic fact that you don't want the economy to literally go to a standstill, and so you want to keep the churn moving a little bit as well. And so ultimately, much of what we did with the CARES Act, most economists on the left and right will agree that we had to do it at that point, or the economy would have gotten even worse, and individuals would have lost their homes, would have lost their businesses forever. And that's how a recession turns into a depression. Now, I think there was a lot of excessive spending in these bills. I think there were a lot of parts where it was misallocated. I think we put too much money into certain items and perhaps not enough into others. So I'm not blanket endorsing it. But the idea that if the government is going to shut down your business and shut down your job, you deserve compensation, I think people agree with that.
Yeah, and you alluded to the American Rescue Plan being much more of a partisan piece of legislation. From your, writing, research, tracking that issue, were Republicans just kind of saying no, we don't need all of this money? Was it just more partisan politics? What was the attitude and the reasoning behind that being a much more kind of Democrat dominated process?
Yeah, I mean, at that point, Republicans had just and Democrats had just done a $900 billion stimulus bill a month earlier. So the idea that Republicans just refuse to spend any money, I think the Republican view is we just did $900 billion a couple of weeks ago, and now the economy is starting to reopen. It's recovering. People are going back to work. The output gap, which is how much economic output we're low on, causing the recession, was getting small. And so I think Republicans said, we don't need a major bill right now again. And Democrats, I think they wanted their big first show of force with a new president. There was a Democratic president, Democratic Congress. We're going to show that we can play hardball and we can pass our own bill. And ultimately, it was mostly just a Democratic wish list. It was a poorly designed bill. You had $350 billion for state governments to deal with budget deficits that didn't even exist. They weren't even running deficits at that point. In fact, most states were running surpluses at that point, and we just gave them $350 billion for nothing. There was huge unemployment bonuses that would continue to pay people more than if they than if they worked. There was an $80 billion bailout to union pensions. It ended up looking less like a COVID bill and more just like a random Democratic giveaway to special interests. Now, Republicans tried to negotiate on this. They said, what if we do $1 trillion? What if we do something less? And President Biden and Democrats made clear, we have the votes. We're going to pass this bill without any compromise. And even as Democratic economists warned them that this was overshooting what the economy needs and was going to cause inflation, and we just did $900 billion 2 months ago, Democrats, I think, wanted to make a political point that they could ram through a bill just like Republicans, and they did.
Now, just because all of that money was spent, and for context, of course, the money Trump spent, the money that's often forgotten about, $900 billion, that was bigger than the Obama plan to get us out of the Great Recession in 2008, caused a lot of controversy, set off Tea Party. So, I mean, we're talking truly uncharted territory when it comes to spending. But Biden wanted even more, than that the American Recovery Plan. He wanted another stimulus, and I correct me if I'm wrong, that didn't happen, but we did get the infrastructure bill, and while Build Back Better did fail, they continue to this day to try to pass that. So, as bad as inflation is now, it seems like Biden had designs on making it way, way worse. Am I
Yeah,
wrong?
people, I think, almost get numb to the numbers. Like $1 trillion spending bills don't happen. um, this was extra. I mean, the biggest stimulus bill during the last recession of 2009 was $787 billion. Most spending increases are usually about $300 or $400 billion over 10 years. So when we did the CARES Act, that was 3 trillion. I mean, that was the biggest peacetime permanent or peacetime spending bill in 50, 60 years, adjusted for inflation. These numbers are enormous. $1 trillion bills do not happen often. And now it's funny in Congress, they won't even get out of bed for less than $1 trillion. But this is totally new, this phenomenon of $1 trillion spending bills. And yeah, President Biden did $1.9 trillion for the American Rescue Plan. A couple months later, he got a $550 billion infrastructure bill. And now he's been trying to pass a Build Back Better plan that, if you assume the extensions, would cost about $4.5 trillion over 10 years. So if you just add those up, it's about $7 trillion. And don't forget, there's also the discretionary spending increases of 8% last year and 8% the president wants this year. That would also cost $1 trillion over 10 years in higher discretionary spending. So you're looking at things like $8 trillion the president is trying to increase in a span of a little over a year. These numbers are like monopoly money. I mean, you can't even conceive of how huge they are. They dwarf anything President Obama ever even considered, anything Bush did, anything Clinton did. But we kind of get sticker shock and 8 trillion, whatever. It's enormous.
Now, Build Back Better does seem to be dead. And I know we're going to talk about the Biden budget that he's proposed, but just before we kind of move on to more of the causes of inflation, how do you gauge that? How much of Build Back Better was folded into the Biden budget? Do you see many of the big provisions in Build Back Better coming to fruition before these elections, or what's the kind of take your betting hat on and put that on?
Last year, I would have told you that some version of Build Back Better will pass. It'll just be a scaled down version. Joe Manchin was saying, I want something smaller, maybe $1.5 trillion over 10 years. Democrats said, forget it. They refused to accept 1.5 trillion. And now they're probably going to end up with nothing, because now that inflation is rising, there's even more concern and opposition over a big $1 trillion spending bill. And I think Manchin has even said the $1.5 trillion offer is not on the table. That's not to say some of the provisions in Build Back Better aren't popular or may not happen. Lawmakers are still talking about bringing back the expanded child tax credit of $3,000 or $3,600 for a child under 5, rather than letting it revert back to its earlier 2,000 level per child. Options like family leave are still out there, more daycare. Some of those smaller pieces may get passed, but the full moonshot of multi-trillion dollars, every week inflation continues to be the biggest problem. That makes it even more unlikely that you're going to see the Democratic votes to pass this stuff. And if Republicans pick up seats, that'll be that. You mentioned the Biden budget. The Biden budget that came out recently endorsed Build Back Better and left the numbers out of its tables. So the Biden administration came out and said, we support Build Back Better. And look, our budget's only going to raise taxes by a little bit, and we're only going to raise spending by a little bit, because they actually didn't count the cost of Build Back Better in their budget numbers. They just left it out. The centerpiece of their entire budget agenda, trillions of dollars, was completely just left out of their budget tables in part to make it look smaller. And I found it extraordinarily dishonest. What's the point of putting out a budget proposal if you're not going to include the cost of the centerpiece of your own agenda?
Wow, that is extraordinary. So, yeah, let's talk about that budget. And there's all kinds of interesting components to discuss. I do want to get back to some of the specific causes of inflation, but yeah, we're kind of at that point talking about the Biden budget, and he proposed this what, a month and a half ago. Uh, where do you see this process going? And talk about some of the additional provisions in the budget. I know some of the tax provisions in particular are causing waves or making waves.
Yeah, the Biden budget is as dead on arrival as any other president's budget. I mean, the president's budget ultimately has no legal importance. It doesn't get introduced as legislation. It just becomes the president's vision. The most important part in the president's budget most years is how much he wants to increase discretionary spending, because that's the one part of the budget that Congress has to do every year. Entitlement programs are generally on autopilot, taxes are generally on autopilot, but the 1/3 of the budget, defense, education, health research, housing, veterans health care, that has to be renewed every year. The president proposed about an 8% increase in that spending again after last year's 8% increase. In fact, I think the non-defense portion would get about a 12% increase. So huge increases from the president in discretionary spending. He also proposed a couple $1 trillion in taxes in addition to the Build Back Better taxes that he didn't even include. And I mean, it's enormous. It's multi-trillion-dollar tax hikes, provisions such as taxing capital gains before they've been sold for certain individuals is extremely complicated and controversial. What they would say is, for certain wealthy people, if your privately held business or your stock investments go up in a given year, even if you don't actually take it out and realize the income, you have to pay taxes on that theoretical income, on those theoretical gains every year. It's extremely complicated and controversial, because usually you would pay the tax out of the income. But if you haven't actually sold the business or sold the stock, you don't have the income to pay the tax. And so I think, and it would also, by the way, it would also be retroactive. So you would have to pay a tax on all your earlier retroactive stock gains for years. So there would be an enormous one-time tax bill. So I think some of this stuff is a little wacky, and it's probably not going to go anywhere.
I mean, I understand that that would be an incredible nightmare for just the IRS and people to enforce it, but it also seems maybe unconstitutional
Yes.
and to cause a variety of problems. So, is Congress just writing? You know, of course, Democrats in Congress, are they just writing their own budget and kind of ignoring the Biden administration? Where does this process stand, and what, if any, of the highlight provisions of the Biden budget do you see making their way into reality?
Congress is going to do what they do always, which is essentially just write their own budget. Even when they like the president, they write their own budget. What they will do is they'll take the fact that the president's calling for an 8% discretionary spending hike, and they won't copy the president's plan specifically, but they'll copy the 8% total and then just write in how they want to allocate the money. The taxes aren't going to go anywhere. The huge capital gains taxes, huge corporate taxes, the really wacky taxing theoretical income, those aren't going to go anywhere, because Democrats just don't have the votes to do that. So ultimately, the rest of the president's budget will basically be ignored, except for Congress excitedly taking the 8% increase in discretionary spending.
And Biden claims somehow that this will reduce the deficit, which, you know, of course, it's always worth reminding folks the deficit and debt are two very different things. I don't even know how you calculate the deficit at this point because of all of these special COVID budget items. But talk just kind of talk about that and work through that for people.
Yeah, the deficit is the annual shortfall, and the debt is how much you owe total. The president's doing something really slippery and dishonest. In fact, I had an article last week in National Review about all the Biden administration's lies, spin, and misrepresentations on economic policy. It's actually remarkable in 14 months how much deceit has come out of the Biden White House on economics. And one of the factors is they're bragging about the fact that the deficit is dropping this year. It was $3 trillion at the peak of the pandemic, and it's going to be $1.4 trillion this year. They're holding that up as some grand accomplishment. The reason the deficit fell is just because the pandemic spending expired on schedule. It wasn't because Joe Biden signed any bill cutting the deficit. In fact, every budget bill he has signed has raised the deficit. What happened was, before the pandemic, the deficit was $988 billion. It spiked to $3 trillion temporarily. And instead of going back down to $1 trillion, Biden increased so much spending that it's going back down to $1.4 trillion when the pandemic spending expires. So it's actually $400 billion higher than it was before the pandemic. But instead, the president is saying, look, I'm a miracle worker. I cut the deficit from $3 trillion to $1.4 trillion, without pointing out the $3 trillion figure was a one-year outlier because of one-year pandemic spending. The president actually has been sabotaging what would have been even greater deficit reduction back down to the level of before the pandemic. So it's amazing that with a deficit 40% higher than it was before the pandemic, President Biden is portraying himself as a deficit reducer simply because the pandemic ended. It's extremely deceitful.
And I'm looking at the latest USA spending. It says by the end of 2021, the federal government had 28.43 trillion in debt. So that continues to grow and grow quickly. No way around it. But kind of to take the discussion a bit full circle, you don't think, and I would imagine most economists don't think that the just ballooning debt by itself is the problem. Talk about the specifics of. Let's get back to inflation and why it really kicked off with that $1.9 trillion American Recovery Plan and the way that the Fed played a role in it. Do you see, and again, reading the tea leaves, do you see us moving back into lower inflation in the not too distant future? Or because of this ballooning debt, are we kind of in this long term?
I would separate the two issues. I think that we're going to come back down to deficits again in about the $1 to $1.4 trillion range, which is really bad. I don't think that's necessarily going to be driving inflation as much. We had $1 trillion deficit before the pandemic, and that wasn't really driving inflation because the Federal Reserve wasn't monetizing as much of it through the printing press. I'm not sure. I think we're going to have inflation for a little while, just because once inflation begins, it's really hard to stop. It's really hard to tame. It's kind of like a fire. And some people say we should allow a little more inflation here and there. The problem is once you allow a little more inflation, you can't put the fire out. Inflation expectations get baked into the cake. Businesses start raising prices because they expect inflation to happen. People start demanding wages because they expect inflation to happen, and then you get the inflation. It's going to be hard to tame, and it's probably going to be painful. It's almost impossible to eliminate 8.5% inflation without essentially grinding the economy to a halt in a way that causes a recession. That's what happened when we had the big recession or the big inflation 40 years ago. The Federal Reserve just raised interest rates so high that they basically ground the economy to a halt, and that's ultimately what broke the back of inflation. I hope we can do a softer landing this time on inflation. I'm not sure we can. Although I do think that's a little separate. I think the deficit concern isn't short-term inflation as much as it is the long-term terrifying numbers. Over the next 30 years, we are projected to run a baseline deficit of $112 trillion. That's the baseline before President Biden or congressional Republicans raise $1 spending program or cut one tax, 112 trillion over 30 years. That's the rosy scenario. That's going to cause significant long-term economic dangers. Although I would separate that out from the short-term inflation concern that ultimately I think was going to become more of a monetary phenomenon over time that the Federal Reserve is probably going to work on.
All right. So we talked about the Fed printing money. We've talked about the supply chain issues. Uh, you look at some of the things that other than that are driving price increases or inflation right now. Energy is at the top of that list. Do obviously it doesn't seem like the Biden administration is going to do anything about that. Do we see energy and other prices remaining elevated, or will the market kind of work things out? How much of this is kind of temporary due to the war in Ukraine and COVID, and how much of this is kind of the Biden administration's policies? I know that's a very, very difficult thing to get a solid answer to.
Energy prices overall are up 32% in the past year. It's one of the biggest drivers of inflation. I mean, it is remarkable. 32%. Gas prices are rising. I think energy. The Biden blames, of course, the energy price rise on the war in Ukraine and our embargo on Russian oil, and of course that's a small contributor. But that just started a few weeks ago. that cannot possibly explain gas and energy prices that started rising a full year ago. Obviously, there's something bigger going on. I think part of the blame long term for energy prices, not as much short term, but long term, is going to be that the Biden administration has been very slow on approving permits for energy exploration, energy drilling. They're looking to move us to green energy more aggressively than probably the economy can handle. Green energy sources are not ready yet to power the entire economy. We need fossil fuels. Frankly, we also need nuclear power. And the Biden administration is dragging their feet on approving permits. As a result, when you do that, you're constraining supply just as energy demand is growing and coming back aggressively after the past year. So of course, there's bottlenecks that are raising prices. Yes, if the Biden administration approved every energy oil drilling plan tomorrow, that wouldn't immediately cut gas prices very much because it takes a while to actually produce the gas and get it into your car. But it would reduce some of the long-term pressures, and we probably would see some of that in futures prices coming down somewhat. And so the Biden administration gets some of the blame, absolutely, for what we're seeing right now with rising energy prices. That's really hurting a lot of families.
Yeah, and New Mexico is front and center in that whole discussion. Just on Friday, I don't know if you saw this, but the Department of Interior announced that it's increasing royalties on federal lands from 12.5% to 18.75%. And they're taking a lot of acreage for leases offline. So instead of increasing, production and working to produce our way out of this problem, the Biden administration seems, at least from a action perspective, to be a-okay with the price increases that are really maybe not driving the entire inflationary situation, but definitely are a major factor.
Yeah, I mean, the Biden administration says that they're really concerned about inflation, and much of what they're doing is worsening it. We're seeing more tariffs. We've lumber tariffs, other tariffs. The Biden administration announced a couple days ago again that it was going to ensure that government only continues to buy American, to only buy steel and aluminum and other factors domestically, and to essentially block cheaper foreign imports. Now, some people may like that. Some people think buy American is a great idea. Some people may see the federal government We should buy American Union work and not buy cheap foreign imports. If that's your viewpoint, fine, but it's inflationary. If there are lower cost options to purchase inputs for businesses and government, and the government is mandating that we will only buy from America, even if the cost is 20, 30, 40, 50% higher, again, you may think that's good policy, good union, red-blooded American policy, but you are raising costs, which are going to be passed on through higher prices. And so if your priority is buy American, if your priority is raising grazing fees or on ranch lands, oil and gas leasing fees in New Mexico and other places, that's fine. But you can't tell me that fighting inflation is your number one priority, because it's not.
And also unions. Biden is a huge proponent of unions, which would also seem to further increase inflation. I think they just had a executive order dealing with federal construction contracts or contracts receiving federal
Yep.
dollars, and he is forcing unions to be involved with all aspects of that, and he wants to insert unions into the electric vehicle manufacturing and all kinds of other stuff. Those are inflationary too, right?
Yeah, and the infrastructure bill had all of this stuff. There's a big push to mandated project labor agreements, which essentially mandate that union workers are be used for projects, that they kind of set the terms of the contract. Requiring union workers, again, requiring Buy America. This, again, you can agree or disagree with these policies on the merits, but nobody who's looked in the issue will dispute that this significantly raises costs for the federal government. It significantly raises costs for businesses to pay these higher prices and higher for their inputs, for their labor, for their goods, and those higher costs do get passed on to consumers. Again, this is inflationary. I think that the Biden administration talks about how concerned they are about inflation, but they are not willing to even to be neutral on inflation. They're actually imposing policies that directly worsen inflation.
Yeah, well, I'm not surprised by that, but it is frustrating, and it's also worth guys like us pointing out that actions are different from rhetoric. Well, Brian, we believe it or not are virtually at the end of our time. I wanted to give you a chance to discuss, any issues that you felt we might have missed or glossed over in our conversation here. Also, a chance to share your latest research and information about inflation and/or the federal budget situation.
I think we've covered it well. I think one issue I wish would get more attention is just I've done a lot lately on, again, the $112 trillion in budget deficits projected over the next 30 years. And in particular, the fact that interest rates are rising, how dangerous it is when you're going to borrow $112 trillion and then interest rates rise on that debt. It will cost an enormous amount of money. In fact, every point that interest rates rise over the projected baseline will cost $30 trillion in new interest costs over the next 30 years. That's like creating an entire new defense department. Every time interest rates rise by 1 point, it's 30 trillion. We need to be very careful about how much we borrow at a time when interest rates are rising. In terms of finding my research, you can find me on the Manhattan Institute website. Just Google my name, Brian Riedl, Riedl, Manhattan Institute. I have my article in National Review about the Biden administration's lies and spins and mistruths. I have a lot of other articles about inflation, government spending. I have an article about how the idea that Republicans do bad for the economy and Democrats do good for the economy, which we see on social media all the time, is actually false if you go through the data. There's a lot there.
Yeah, and did want to hit on that. Interest rates have already gone up a little bit, and that's part of the Fed's effort to kind of rein in inflation. But by reining in inflation, they could cause additional problems for the federal debt and the overall U.S. economy if those debt payments grow out of control. Any specific comments on that issue?
Yeah, I mean, I did a full report in December on how interest rates themselves could drive a debt crisis. Again, every point they rise will cost 30 trillion over 30 years. Let me give you some scary numbers. The CBO says interest rates will rise to about 4.5% over the next 30 years, which is actually pretty modest with the amount of debt. At that point, interest will be the biggest part of the budget and consume half of all tax revenues. Now, if interest rates rise one more point, then interest will consume 70% of all tax revenues. And if interest rates rise 2 more points, then at that point, interest on the debt will consume 100% of all tax revenues. We have a ticking time bomb right here in the federal budget. We have essentially set our fiscal and budget policy on the hope that interest rates never rise above 2% ever again. If they go to 4, 5, or God help us, 6% with the amount we're borrowing, we are going to have a colossal debt crisis. And the government is practicing no risk management. There is no backup plan if interest rates rise. Our fiscal policy right now is to borrow over $100 trillion and just cross our fingers that interest rates on that debt will stay below 2% forever. I have a report I wrote in December where I ran through the numbers of how much higher interest rates would cost us, and it is calamitous.
All right. Well, Brian, thanks for being that ray of sunshine for all of us here
Sorry.
on the Tipping Point podcast. But it is a much needed kind of slap in the face in terms of the way that our government is spending, and it's completely unsustainable. So I do appreciate your time today. And by all means, please look for Brian, his writing, research at the Manhattan Institute, at National Review, etc. So thanks again for your time, and thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube and Rumble channels. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.